form of metaphysics, while they make use of perfectly ordinary terms such as priority, fundamental, and ultimately. They use them in a distinctively non ordinary metaphysical way. Second wave skeptics, by contrast, generally grant the notion of grounding is coherent, but they think that it doesn't belong in our theoretical toolkit in any case, as the arguments in favor of positing grounding aren't persuasive. What unites second wave skeptics is a shared sense that grounding theorizing is simultaneously undermotivated and overreaching. So, roughly speaking, monists claim that there is ultimately just one core type of grounding, while pluralists claim that there are different types or no core type. It is important to note that being a pluralist about grounding does not necessarily make you a grounding skeptic, at least given how we understand the usage of the term. It is true that pluralists, as we've just seen, are skeptics, but not all of them are. For example, find a proponent of grounding if anyone is, stresses the difference between various forms of grounding, rejecting the idea that they are unified in a way that might motivate positing a generic form of grounding, just what might make it fitting to call one a pluralist view a version of skepticism about grounding, and another pluralist view about non skeptical instead is perhaps worth further thought. So, looks like we're back up live. So, sorry about that. And memes, thanks for tuning in. So,
yeah, my computer just decided to restart itself. Sorry about that.
yeah, I think this issue, I mean, even like the theory of everything or nature of what is science is central in this grounding issue. So let me just read a tiny bit more. Um,
You
how
think
grounding,
science centers on grounding? It's so funny because, like, I thought the whole thing with science was that it was the whole one of the virtues of science was this like ontological independence.
yeah, but science has to be metaphysically grounded. And that's why I said that the notions
Well,
of,
if it's ontologically independent, then it doesn't need to be metaphysically grounded because the notion of metaphysical grounding could be argued to be a matter of settling ontological dependence. I'm not saying that's my argument. I'm just saying you can see how it would be appealing.
well, that was kind of what the neo Kantians were trying to say. So, how grounding might be
Is it?
related to the notions of necessity, essence, and fundamentality. There are interesting issues concerning the relationship between grounding and other phenomenon. Um, in addition to the examples listed at the beginning of this entry, one such issue is the relation between grounding and degrees of reality. Necessity. How do grounding and necessity interact? Say P and P prime metaphysically necessitate Q, just in case any possible world in which the former obtains is a world in which the latter obtains. The broad consensus is that necessity isn't sufficient for grounding. It's not the case that if P and P prime necessitate Q, then the former ground the latter. Consider a necessary fact, such as arithmetic. While this fact might have grounds, facts say uh, there are other issues about relationship between grounding and necessity that are less of settled matters. So this gets more straight into logical terminology. There's a section of essence and fundamentality. So these were three sister issues that are at the heart of our weekly discussions. So,
I'm sorry about the video getting interrupted.
no problem. So, Doovid,
I need to get, and also to the audience, sorry to do it, and to the audience. And it was such an interesting conversation. And sorry that you had to miss that little bit of it. But I think we're going to come back to this a lot. A lot, a lot, a lot. So
yeah, so
stay
this is
tuned.
probably the actually most important of the three. So,
Well,
like
we're talking
fundamental,
about sort of meshing up the historical development of thought with particular ideas throughout history. So, yeah, I think it's kind of coalescing in this
yeah, I mean,
post
this really
Kantian
isn't even that historical.
paradigm.
It's more definitional, and I mean, logic isn't even the proper word. There's really ontology, which I mean, you could say even logic is grounded in an ontology, and
It just
you're,
depends if you want to define logic as an abstract thing or as a concrete thing, I think. At the end of the day, and we don't have a very particular definition of logic, it's usually just taken for granted.
yeah. So I think technically
And
ontological
that's the
dependence.
kind of thing that it's like, I don't know, most people can't understand that, but I'm pretty sure you can understand what I just said.
Yeah, I think so. So I
And
mean,
you can restate it in a way that's easier to understand. So I see that as very valuable.
yeah. So technically, the most important concept is probably this ontological dependence in relation to metaphysical grounding and fundamentality, and it's where the concept of primitives come most into play. And so, ontological dependence is a relation, or more accurately, a family of relations between entities or beings. From there are various ways in which one being may be said to depend upon one or more other beings, in a sense of depend that is distinctly metaphysical in character and that may be contrasted thus with various causal senses of the world. More specifically, a being may be said to depend in such a sense upon one or more other beings for its existence or for its identity. A traditional approach was to analyze all forms of ontological dependence in modal terms, that is, in terms of distinctly metaphysical notions of possibility and necessity. But more recently, an analysis in terms of the notion of essence has become popular. A third option is to treat the notion of ontological dependence as a metaphysical primitive, in which case it is not possible to give a further definition of it. This entry will remain neutral about the ultimate basis of ontological dependence. At least in some cases, it is possible to use ontological dependence as a tool to describe the relationship between entities without taking a stand about its basis. But in other cases, this may not be possible. Notions of ontological dependence are frequently called upon by metaphysicians in their proposed analysis of other metaphysical important notions, such as the notion of substance, or that the tropes depend for their existence on a substance. And a lot of this actually is straight logical notation. A crucial notion in metaphysics is that one entity depending for its existence upon another entity, not in a merely causal sense, but in a deeper ontological sense. The kind of dependence in question must also be distinguished from any kind of logical dependence, because logical relations, strictly speaking, cannot obtain between concrete objects nor between abstract objects. They're not propositional in nature. We should also distinguish ontological dependence, broadly conceived, from what is usually considered a stricter type of metaphysical dependence, namely metaphysical grounding. The link between ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding will be discussed below, but this entry concerns a somewhat broader family of relations of dependence. The notion of ontological independence is also important and will be used to describe the idea that something is fundamental. While much of the early work on ontological dependence was done primarily in setting where dependence was thought to be an inherently modal notion, the recent trend in hyper intentional metaphysics has had an enormous impact for discussion surrounding dependence. The thought here is that we need more fine grained tools than mere necessary equivalents. Two statements can apply to the very same entities across all possible worlds but not be equivalent. Hence, the notion of essence is often invoked, and many would now regard the ultimate basis of dependence to be essence. Finally, it is entirely possible to deny both approaches and regard the notion of ontological dependence itself as a primitive. Some will regard the notions of metaphysical grounding or fundamentality to be similarly primitive. Primitivism does not mean that the notion is mysterious or obscure, and we can still illuminate it by describing its instances, but it does not mean that the notion is unanalyzable. In what follows, the discussion will roughly follow the historical development, starting with the attempts to give a modal existential analysis of ontological dependence. As we will see, These attempts do have some serious shortcomings, even if they can be of use, especially in certain restricted contents. We see that there are important cases where a more fine grained asymmetric notion of explanatory dependence seems warranted. We will then proceed to an essential analysis of dependence, a discussion of the relationship between metaphysical grounding and dependence, finishing with a brief discussion of various other connections and applications. To get started, we may consider very simplified examples. It is not uncommon to see the notion of ontological dependence used in a rather coarse grained manner, given that it encompasses a family of relations. For instance, sets ontologically depend on their members, electricity ontologically depends on electrons, Socrates does not ontologically depend on singleton Socrates. So this goes on. I shared the link. I recommend people to read through this. You have any comments on this?
I guess I was just wondering whether Thad had metaphysically grounded his work and sort of chuckling at that idea. But no, otherwise, this is, nothing to report, useful information. Pretty much what I thought it would be, to be honest.
Okay, so essential dependence, identity dependence. Why essential dependence? Until quite recently, it was common to think of ontological dependence can be fully characterized in modal existential terms, as we've seen above. One obvious reason for this is that if one adopts the usual modalist analysis of essence, essential dependence will collapse into a form of modal existential dependence. But it seems clear already, starting from Aristotle, that there is an alternative way to formulate ontological dependence if essence is not analyzed in modal terms. However, this is not to suggest that Aristotle did not rely on modal existential notion of ontological dependence. Rather, there are reasons to think that Aristotle's understanding of dependence encompasses both the modal existential notion and the essential notion to be described below. One motivation for developing a non-modal conception of ontological dependence is that the modal existential analysis appears to be too coarse-grained for some cases. We have already discussed some of these cases, but the most well-known examples have been made famous by Fine. Consider that, for instance, what the modal existential account entails in the case of necessary existence. Take Socrates and the number two. Given that the numbers necessarily exist, it is necessarily the case that two exists if Socrates does. But presumably, we do not want to say that Socrates depends on the number two, or indeed on most necessarily existent that you might put in the place of two. So the modal existential account makes everything depend upon every necessary existent, which seems like the wrong result. Admittedly, those who defend a modal existential analysis of ontological dependence could insist that it applies only to contingent objects. Simons makes this type of qualification by focusing on concrete entities, hence excluding necessary existence by definition. He also excludes self-dependence. Simon calls the resulting notion of dependence weak rigid dependence, but a stronger notion, strong rigid dependence, is also defined. The latter is a special case of the former. One example of weak rigid dependence is defined by Simons would be a particular water molecule depending for its existence on a particular oxygen atom. In the case of strong rigid dependence, the dependent object cannot be a proper part of the object it depends on, so object X is strongly rigidly dependent on object Y if X depends for its existence on Y and Y is not a proper fit of X. One example of strong rigid dependence defined thus would be a trope or mode depending for its existence on a substance. In addition to these rigid notions, Simons defines corresponding notions of weak and strong generic dependence. While it's possible to avoid some of the challenges raised for the modal existential account with these qualifications, they do nevertheless call for an alternative, more fine-grained account of ontological dependence that could be applied to necessary existence. At last resort, a proponent of the modal existential account who does not wish to buy into essentialist ontology could simply bite the bullet and insist that every contingent entity does rigidly depend for its existence on necessary existence. One reason to do so would be the ability to get by with a sparser battery of formal ontological tools, a consideration motivated by parsimony. The modal existential analysis of ontological dependence can thus be developed further, and it can perhaps overcome some of the problems that were pointed out earlier. But there are areas where more fine grained notion would seem to be required, and there is also a historical precedent for such a notion. It should be noted, though, that much of the contemporary literature in defense of non-modal fine-grained analysis operates in a neo-Aristotelian framework, which typically assumes some non-modalist version of essentialism. Accordingly, there is an obvious rift between modal existential analysis and essentialist analysis, one that we cannot fully bridge. Here, in any case, it is good to keep in mind that the notion of ontological dependence itself, when used as a tool to formulate the commitments of a specific theory, does not immediately force one to make a commitment in this regard, even though some of the applications may entail such a commitment. Identity dependence. A point of entry to the idea that there are notions of dependence not analyzable in terms of the modal existence account, and hence a motivation to pursue a non-modal analysis of dependence altogether, are the cases that do not seem to involve a requirement for existence at all. Indeed, as we already saw in the case, Socrates does not ontologically depend on singleton Socrates. It seems that something beyond mere existential independence is being expressed. Indeed, one might say that singleton Socrates does not have anything to do with the identity or essence of Socrates, and it is this lack of identity dependence between Socrates and that which we wish to express. In other words, being a member of a singleton Socrates is not an essential property of Socrates. Recall that a similar issue seemed to arise with regard to the possibility of composite objects having essential proper parts. We will now consider a more systematic method of dealing with cases of dependence involving the essences or essential properties of objects. It is quite straightforward to define essential dependence, although a formal definition will be given below. Before that, we ought to get a better picture of what it means to say that an object depends upon something for its identity. That is, we should clarify the relation of identity dependence. Note that the notion of identity at play here is not the one symbolized with the equal sign. Rather, we mean identity in the sense of what a thing is or which thing of a certain kind a thing is. Aristotle's tu te este, the what it is. Informally speaking, to say that the identity of X depends on the identity of Y, or more briefly, that X depends for its identity upon Y, is to say that which thing of its kind Y is fixes, or at least helps to fix, which things of its kind X is. By fixes, in this context, is mean metaphysically determined. For instance, then the identity of a set is fixed by the identities of its members, as was hinted before. Likewise, the identity of an assassination is at least partially fixed in the identity of a person assassinated. The relationships of identity dependence and direct consequences of the identity criteria governing the kinds of which the items thus related are instances. One way to attempt to precisify the notion of essence is to note that we are here concerned with identity in the same sense of individuality rather than the relation of identity. In other words, identity dependence expresses the determination of the individuality of objects in terms of the individuality of objects. Thus, the identity dependence of a set upon its members could be regarded as a consequence of the fact that the axiom of extensionality functions as the criterion of identity for sets. The set's members determine the individuality of the set, they individuate the set. Notice here that we allow that X may be said to depend for its identity upon Y, even in cases in which the identity of Y alone does not suffice to fix the identity of X. So, for example, a set with two or more members depends for its identity upon each of them, although its identity is only completely fixed by the identities of all of them. Another way to specify the notion of essence being used is to resort to Fine's distinction between constitutive and consequential essence. A property belongs to the constitutive essence of an object if it is not had in virtue of being a logical consequence of some more basic essential property, and a property might be said to be the consequential essence of an object if it is a logical consequence of properties that belong to the constitutive essence. Fine goes on to note the property of singleton Socrates, namely containing Socrates as a sole member, will presumably be part of the constitutive essence of Socrates. In contrast, the property of containing some member of another is only part of the consequential essence. It is evidence that in cases of essential and identity dependence, we are typically interested in the constitutive notion of essence because it is presumably also part of the consequential essence. So using the consequential notion of essence to define essential and identity dependence would quickly lead to the problems not unlike the ones faced by the modal existential account. Accordingly, in what follows, the various definitions should be, in the first instance, be understood to concern the constitutive essence. But the problem that remains is the distinction between constitutive and consequential essence itself is not always easy to make, and it is inevitable that there will be some controversial cases. So this goes on pretty far, but I wanted to cover the comparison of ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding. And I think this relates actually directly to mathematics in the sense that if we're talking about science versus mathematics and the nature of formulas, universal laws, and propositional logic. So to say, is science ontological, metaphysical, logical, and the if to say the fundamental issue here is ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding.
Yeah, they seem like kind of at odds. Because the former seems to like put everything on the same level, and the latter seems to imply a hierarchy. But I would agree that they're connected in some sense. And I would say that the former is closer to reflecting the state of affairs, and the latter is more of a model of the state of affairs. And we need models to make sense of things.
In
So,
models,
if that's correct, then I guess metaphysical grounding would make more sense than ontological dependence, which would just be like too abstract, like consciousness, basically, in my opinion.
okay, so the notion of ground stormed in contemporary analytical metaphysics in the beginning of the 21st century, but the roots of the notion go back to Aristotle. Sometimes grounding is understood as metaphysical explanation. To be more precise, when some x is grounded in some y, it is usually thought that y explains x, and grounding either is that explanatory relationship or backs that explanation. Moreover, the status of y is generally thought to be somehow prior to that of x. Grounding is typically understood to express priority between things. For instance, we might say that the members of a set are prior to the set itself. The existence of the set is grounded in its members. Or to take a more concrete example, the existence of any given composite object is grounded in the existence of its parts. For instance, we might suggest that the existence of any given water molecule is grounded in the existence of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Somewhat more controversial, we might also say that mental states are grounded in physical states. In each of the mentioned examples, there appears to be an ontological dependence relation between the grounded entity and the grounding entity or entities. In fact, we have already discussed some of these examples in terms of ontological dependence above. This naturally leads one to question whether grounding just is ontological dependence or whether ontological dependence is grounding. One motivation for finding a systematic link between the ontological dependence and grounding is that it would be more parsimonious to have two primitive notions. An initial reason to distinguish ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding is that the latter is a much stricter notion. Consider the idea that ontological dependence could be reflexive. There is nothing in the theory that rules out a relation of ontological dependence obtaining in such a way that a given object is dependent on itself. It is, of course, controversial whether there actually are such entities, but this is not enough to consider irreflexivity as the necessary requirement for ontological dependence. In contrast, metaphysical grounding is usually considered to be necessary irreflexive. A more general issue concerns the modal implications of each notion. In particular, is there a form of ontological dependence that is both necessary and sufficient for grounding? This seems unlikely. While there are some instances of grounding which are clearly rigid in the same sense as rigid existential dependence, it is also clear that the connection is not necessarily insufficient. Take, for instance, the fact F and assume that it's fully grounded in G. This entails that F cannot be grounded except by G. An example would be the case of Acetyl Singleton Socrates, whose existence is rigidly grounded in the fact that Socrates exists. In such cases, F rigidly existentially depends upon G, and is also plausible that F depends for its identity upon G. However, other instances of grounding do not require that the grounded facts rigidly depend on its grounds. For example, suppose that F is the fact about a particular subject is feeling pain, and that F is fully grounded in a particular neural fact about the subject, G. It seems possible that the subject could have been in pain, so F could have been obtained even if G did not obtain. This would be the case if F had been grounded in a different neural fact, H. In this case, F cannot depend for its identity upon G since F is not rigidly dependent upon G. This rules out some simple option for linking grounding and rigid ontological dependence, but there are arguably also problems for linking it with generic varieties of ontological dependence. If grounding cannot be easily analyzed with the help of rigid generic dependence, then we might instead suggest that if grounding were to be understood as a type of ontological dependence, it would be some sort of explanatory dependence. This idea that whatever does the grounding also somehow explains what is being grounded is a crucial part of the notion's appeal. Relations of ontological dependence often seem to have a similar type of explanatory role, but the link to explanation may appear weaker. Even though the existence of water depends on the existence of hydrogen and oxygen, it does not seem to be the case that the existence of hydrogen and oxygen explain the existence of water. Rather, what explains the existence of water is the ability of hydrogen and oxygen atoms to form molecules. So there's at least some differences in accounting for all relations of ontological dependence in terms of grounding relations. We need something stricter than just an explanatory role to identify grounding. Otherwise, we would end up with a much too liberal notion, for we may regard a number of loosely connected things explanatory in some very loose sense. For instance, we might say that the fact that Smith murdered Jones is explained by certain events in Smith's childhood, but a more direct explanation might be Smith's desire to rob Jones. Certain events in Smith's childhood may help us understand why Smith has murderous desires, but it's not clear that they serve to ground the fact that Smith murdered Jones. One suggestion that may help to make grounding more precise would be to focus on priority. To reiterate the example used above, if the members of a set are prior to the set itself, then the existence of the set is grounded in its member. So the grounding entities are prior to or more fundamental than the grounded entities. Metaphors abound, but a typical way to express the idea is to say that X is fundamental or ontologically independent of, in the sense, if and only if nothing grounds X. This is another sense in which grounding would seem to come apart from certain types of ontological dependence, as a purely modal existential understanding of dependence and without any claim to priority is also possible. This is, of course, the sense which we defined above in terms of necessitation. Even if X rigidly necessitates Y, that does not entail that Y must be ontologically prior to X. At any rate, it would be apt to say that parents are more fundamental than their children, even if there is a rigid existential dependency between parents and their children. All this would appear to suggest that it isn't straightforward to define grounding simply as a variety of ontological dependence, or the other way around. In any case, even if we could define one notion in terms of another, it seems that there are aspects of ontological dependence that are not captured by all accounts of grounding, as well as aspects of grounding that are not captured by all accounts of ontological dependence. The situation may, of course, change depending on one's preferred account of dependence and grounding. Accordingly, for this time being, it is advisable to keep the notions apart, especially since there are some further formal differences that need to be taken into account. In particular, grounding is most commonly understood as a strict partial order, which entails irreflexivity, transitivity, and asymmetry. If this is correct, grounding could only capture a very specific variety of ontological dependence, as we have seen that there are varieties of ontological dependence that violate these formal features. Some have also grounded that grounding itself violates all or some of these formal features, so it's not entirely uncontroversial that grounding truly is a strict partial ordering. Given this, the exact link between grounding and ontological dependence remains open, subject to further investigation and formal features. So, just a definition: supervenience, truth making, substance, fundamentality. So this is pretty in depth. Um, hope it was interesting, somewhat insightful.
Yeah, definitely helps me understand the current state of literature. What could be more useful? I wouldn't have even known where to start, to be honest. So, yeah, great. Do you have more links you want to share? Because I see there's like a bunch of tabs, so feel free.
Yeah, yeah, endless links. Thank God. In fact, I just opened a new link from Fine, the historical overview and guide to ground, 60 pages. So let me come back to um, this thing that Jennifer shared at the beginning, and maybe, you know, what I just read on metaphysical grounding, um, ontological dependence, and fundamentality will have some sort of insight on the crisis, the foundation of mathematics. So, where was the section here? So, if you want to say something real quick, let me just find. Um,
Hi, everyone. I hope that people were able to rejoin the link. I'll, yeah.
okay.
Anyway, you
Early in
ready
the
to take
12th
back over?
century, there were debates about set theory, about the concept of the continuum, about the role of logic and the axiomatic method versus the role of intuition. Um, by about 1925, there was a crisis in the proper sense during which the main opinions in these debates were developed and turned into detailed mathematical research projects. In the 1930s, Gödel proved his incompleteness results, which could not be assimilated without some cherished beliefs being abandoned. So, early foundational questions. Evidence in 1899, Hilbert endorsed the viewpoint that came to be known as logicism. Logicism was the thesis that the basic concepts of mathematics are definable by means of logical notions, and that the key principles of mathematics are deducible from logical principles alone. Over time, this thesis had become unclear based as it seems to be on the fuzzy and immature conception of the scope of logical theory. But historically speaking, logicism was a neat intellectual reaction to the rise of modern mathematics, and particularly to the set theoretical approach to methods, since the majority opinion was that set theory is just a part of refined logic. This thesis was thought to be supported by the fact that the theories of natural and real numbers can be derived from set theory, and also by the increasing important role of set theoretical methods in algebra in real and complex analysis. Hilbert was followed by Dedekind in the way he understood mathematics. For us, the essence of Hilbert and Dedekind's early logicism is their self conscious endorsement of certain modern methods, however daring they seemed at the time. These methods had emerged gradually during the 19th century and were particularly associated with Göttingen mathematics, Gauss, and Dirichlet. They experienced a crucial turning point with Riemann's novel idea and were developed further by Dedekind, Cantor, Hilbert, and lesser figures. Meanwhile, the influential Berlin School of Mathematics had opposed this new trend, knocker head on, and Weierstrass more subtly. The name Weierstrass is synonymous with the introduction of rigor in real analysis, but in fact, as will be indicated below, he did not favor the more modern methods of elaborated in his time. Mathematicians in Paris and elsewhere also harbored doubts about these new radical ideas. The most characteristic traits of the modern approach were acceptance of the notion of an arbitrary function proposed by Dirichlet, a wholehearted acceptance of infinite sets in the higher infinite, a preference to put thoughts in place of calculations, and to concentrate on structures characterized axiomatically, and a reliance on purely existential methods of proof. So this whole paper was pretty good, um, but this was the one that Jennifer had shared, and just because we were talking arbitrary earlier, um, let me read the part on arbitrary. So Riemann and Dedekind were always in favor of Dirichlet's abstract idea of the function f as an arbitrary way of associating with each x some y equals f of x. Previously, it had been required that y should be expressed in terms of x by means of an explicit formula. In his letters, Weierstrass criticized the conception of Dirichlet as too general and vague to constitute the starting point of any interesting mathematical development. He seems to have missed the point that it was the fact just the right framework to which to define and analyze general concepts such as continuity and integration. So the f is considered termed arbitrary. So when you say that y equals f of x is a as a formulation that has some philosophical basis. Um, so let's get to the crisis. 1921, Mathematical Zeitschrift published a paper by Weil in which the famous mathematician who was a disciple of Hilbert openly espoused intuitionalism and diagnosed a crisis in the foundation of mathematics. This crisis pointed towards the dissolution of the old state of analysis by means of Brouwer's revolution. Weil's paper was meant as a propaganda pamphlet to rouse the sleepers, and it certainly did. Hilbert answered in the same year, accusing Brouwer and Weil of attempting a putsch aimed at establishing a dictatorship. The foundational debate shifted dramatically towards the battle between Hilbert's attempts to justify classical mathematics and Brouwer developing reconstruction of a much reformed intuitionist mathematics. Just make sure I got the link here in the chat. Why was Brouwer revolutionary? Up to 1920, the key foundational issues had been the acceptability of the real numbers and more fundamentally of the predictivity of strong existential assumptions of set theory, which supported the higher infinite and the unrestricted use of existential proofs. Set theory, and by implication, classical analysis, had been criticized for the reliance on impredicable, predicative definitions and for their strong existential assumptions, in particular the axiom of choice, whose extensive use in classical analysis was demonstrated by Sierpinski in 1918. And we had talked about in week in review before Zermelo's axiom of choice. Thus, the debate in the first 2 decades in the 20th century was mainly about the principles to accept when it came to defining and establishing the existence of sets and subsets. The key question was, can one make rigorous the vague idea behind talk of arbitrary sets? The most coherent reaction had been Zermelo's axiomatization of set theory and Weil's predicative system. Brouwer, however, brought new and even more basic questions to the fore. No one had questioned the traditional ways of reasoning about the natural numbers, classical logic, in particular the use of quantifiers and the principle of the excluded middle, had been used in the context without hesitation. But Brouwer put forward principal critiques of these assumptions and started developing an alternative theory of analysis that was much more radical than Weil's. In doing so, he came upon a new theory of the continuum, which finally enticed Weil and made him announce the coming of a new age, which is intuitionism. And whole question of the connection of logic. So let me go back to Hilbert on page 9. Someone's reading along. um, Hilbert, 1928 phrasing, to eliminate from the world once and for all the skeptical doubts as to the acceptability of the classical theorems of mathematics. The new perspective, which he started to develop in 1904, relied heavily on formal logic and a combinatorial study of the formulas that are provable from given formulas, the axioms. With modern logic, proofs are turned into formal computations that can be checked mechanically so that the process is purely constructivistic. In light of our previous discussion, it is interesting that the new project was to employ uh, Kronecker-Keckerian means for a justification of modern anti-Kronecker-Keckerian methodology. Hilbert's aim was to show that it is impossible to prove a contradictory formula from the axioms. Once this has been shown combinatorially or constructively, the argument can be regarded as a justification of the axiom system, even if we read the axioms as talking about a non-Kroneckerian objects like the real numbers or transitive sets. Still, Hilbert's ideas at the time were marred by deficient understanding of logical theory. It was only in 1970-18 that Hilbert returned to the topic, now with a refined understanding of logical theory and greater awareness of the considerable technical difficulties of his project. Other mathematicians played a very significant part in promoting this better understanding. By 1921, helped by his consistent Bernays, Hilbert had arrived at a very refined conception of the formalization of mathematics and had perceived the need for deeper and more carefully probing into the logical structure of mathematical proofs and theorems. His program was clearly formulated in a talk at Leipzig in 1922. Here we describe the mature form of Hilbert's program as it was presented, for instance, in the 1925 paper on the infinite. The main goal was to establish by means of a syntactic consistency proofs the logical acceptability of the principles and modes of inference in modern mathematics. Axiomatics, logic, and formalizations made it possible to study mathematical theories from a purely mathematical standpoint, hence the name meta mathematics. And Hilbert hoped to establish the non contradictoriness of the theories by employing very weak means. In particular, Hilbert hoped to explain all the criticisms of Weil and Brouwer and thereby justify set theory, the classical theory of real numbers, classical analysis, and of course, classical logic. The whole point of Hilbert's approach was to make mathematical theories fully precise so that it would become possible to obtain precise results about properties of the theory. The following steps are indispensable for the completion of such a program. Finding suitable axioms and primitive concepts for a mathematical theory, such as that the real numbers. Finding axioms and inference rules from classical logic, which makes the passage from given propositions to new propositions a purely syntactic formal procedure. Formalizing mathematical theory by means of formal logic calculus so that propositions are just strings of symbols and proofs are consequences of such strings that obey the formal rules of inference, and a finitary study of formalized proofs that shows that it is possible for strings of symbols that express a contradiction to be the last line of a proof. In fact, steps 2 and 3 can be solved with rather simple systems formalized in first order logic, like those studied in the Introduction to Mathematical Logic, such as Dedekind piano arithmetic and Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. It turns out that first order logic is enough to codifying mathematical proofs, but interestingly, this realization came rather late after Gödel's theorem. Hilbert's main insight was that when theories are formalized, any proof becomes finite combinatorial object. It is just an array of strings or symbols complying with the formal rules of the systems. As Bernays said, this was like projecting the deductive structure of a theory T into a number theoretical domain, and if it became possible to express in this domain the consistency of T mathematical uh, theorems, these realizations raised hope that a finitary study of formalized proofs would suffice to establish the consistency of the theory, that is, to prove the sentence expressing the consistency of mathematical theories. But this hope, not warranted by the previous insight, turned out to be wrong. Also, a crucial presupposition of the program was that not only logical calculus but also each of the axiomatic systems would be complete. Roughly speaking, this means that there would be sufficiently powerful to allow the derivation of all the relevant results. This assumption turned out to be wrong for systems that contained primitive recursive arithmetic, as Gödel showed. It remained to explain why Hilbert meant bifinitism. This is one of the points in which his program in the 1920s adopted some extent to the principle intuitions intuitionists such as Poincare and Brouwer, and deviated strongly from the ideals Hilbert himself hadn't considered in 1900. The key idea is that, contrary to the view of logicists like Frege and Dedekind, logic and pure thought requires something that is intuitively and our immediate experience the signs and formulas. In 1905, Poincare put forth the view that formal consistency proof for arithmetic would be circular. As such, a demonstration would have to proceed by induction on the length of formulas and proofs, and thus would rely on the same axiom of induction that was supposed to establish. Hilbert replied in the 1920s that the form of induction required at the metamathematical level is much weaker than full arithmetic induction, and that this weak form is grounded in the finitary consideration of signs that he took to be intuitively given. Finitary mathematics was not in need of any further justification or reduction. Hilbert's program proceeded gradually, but studying weak theories at first and proceeding to progress with stronger ones. The meta theory of a formal system studies properties such as consistency, completeness, and some others. Completeness in the logical sense means that all true or valid formulas that can be represented in the calculus are formally deduced in it. Propositional logic was quickly proved to be consistent and complete. First order logic, also known as predicate logic, was proved complete by Gödel in his dissertation in 1929. For all of the 1920s, the attention of Hilbert and his co-workers was set on elementary arithmetic and its subsystems. Once this had been settled, the project was to move on to the much more difficult but crucial cases of the theory of real numbers and set theory. Ackermann and von Neumann were able to establish consistency results for certain subsystems of arithmetic, but between 1928 and 1930, Hilbert was convinced that the consistency of arithmetic had already been established. Then came the severe blow of Gödel's incompleteness results. The name formalism, as a description of this program, came from the fact that Hilbert's method consisted in formalizing each mathematical theory and formally studying its proof structure. However, this name is rather one-sided and even confusing, especially because it is usually contrasted with intuitism, a full-blown philosophy of mathematics. Like most mathematicians, Hilbert never viewed mathematics as a mere game played with formulas. Indeed, he often emphasized the meaningfulness of mathematical statements and the depth of conceptual content expressed in them. So the next section is personality difficulties between Hilbert and Brouwer. And if you want to give a quick comment, and I'll do the last section on Gödel in the aftermath. It seems interesting what I read that, the terminology of metaphysical grounding or ontological dependence, seems quite related to this, although they don't use that framing, which I guess has become more popular in the last few decades.
I'm just surprised that they, didn't think that establishing the consistency of first order logic wasn't circular. But anyway, what do I know?
It was not until the Annalan War that Hilbert won. The mathematical community as a whole continued to work in the style of modern mathematics, and yet his program suffered a profound blow with the publication of Gödel's famous 1931 article, An Extremely Ingenious Development of Mathematical Methods. The arithmetization of metamathematics allowed Gödel to prove that systems like axiomatic set theory or Dedekind piano arithmetic are incomplete. That is, there exist propositions P formulated strictly in the language of the system such that neither P nor not P is formally provable in the system. This theorem already presented a deep problem for Hilbert's endeavor, as it showed that formal proof cannot even capture arithmetic truth. But there was more. A close look at Gödel's arguments made it clear that This first metamathematical proof could itself be formalized, which led to Gödel's second theorem that it is impossible to establish the consistency of the systems mentioned above by any proof that can be codified within them. Gödel's arithmetization of metamathematics makes it possible to build a sentence in the language of formal arithmetic that expression that expresses the consistency of the same formal system, and the sentence turns out to be among those that are unprovable. To express this contrapositively, a finitary formula proof of the impossibility of proving 1 equals zeros could be transformed into a contradiction of the system. Thus, if the system is indeed consistent, there is no such finitary proof. According to what Gödel called at the time the von Neumann conjecture, namely that if there is a finitary proof of consistency, then it can be formalized and codified within elementary arithmetic. The second theorem applies the failure of Hilbert's program. And for the reception, one should emphasize that Gödel's negative results are purely constructivist and even finistic, valid for all parties in the foundational debate. They were difficult to digest, but in the end they led to a reestablishment of the basic terms of foundational studies. Mathematical logic and foundational studies continued to develop brilliantly with Gensim-style proof theory, with the rise of model theory, all of which had their roots in the foundational studies of the first third of the 20th century. Although the Zumero-Frankel axioms suffice for giving a rigorous foundation to most of today's mathematics and have rather convincingly intuitive justification in terms of iterative conception of sets, there is a general feeling that the foundational studies, instead of achieving their ambitious goals, found themselves attracted into the role of a mathematical activity and are now enjoying full voting rights in the mathematical Senate. However, the impression is somewhat superficial. Proof theory has developed, leading to noteworthy reductions in classical theories to systems that can now be regarded as constructive. A striking example is that analysis can be formalized as conservative extensions of arithmetic, that is, in systems that extend the language of arithmetic while including all theorems of arithmetic, but which are conservative in the sense that they have no new consequences in the language of arithmetic. Some parts of the analysis can even be developed in conservative extensions of primitive recursive arithmetic. This raises questions about the philosophical basis on which the admissibility of the relevant constructive theories can be founded. But for these systems, the question is far less simple than it was for Hilbert's finitary mathematics. It seems fair to say that no general consensus has yet been reached. Whatever its root and justifications may be, mathematics is a human activity. The truism is clear from the subsequent development of our story. The mathematical community refused to abandon classical ideas and methods. The constructivist revolution was aborted. In spite of its failure, formalism established itself and practices the avowed ideology of the 20th century mathematicians. Some have remarked that formalism was less a real faith than a Sunday refuge for those who spent their weekdays working on mathematical objects as something very real. The Platonism of working days was only abandoned, as the Bourbaki member said, when a ready-made reply was needed to unwelcome philosophical questions concerning mathematical knowledge. One should note that formalism suited very well the needs of the self-conscious, autonomous community of research mathematicians. It granted them full freedom to choose their topics and to employ modern methods to explore them. However, to reflected mathematical minds, it has long been clear that this is not the answer. Epistemological questions about mathematical knowledge have not been eliminated from the world. Philosophers, historians, cognitive scientists, and others keep looking for more adequate ways of understanding its content and development. Needless to say, this does not threaten the autonomy of mathematical researchers. If autonomy is to be concerned, perhaps we should worry instead about the pressures exerted on us by the market of other powers. Both semi-constructivists and modern mathematics have continued to develop. On the one hand, one may mention the work of Harvey Friedman, among others. On the other, there is an impressive expansion of category theory. The contrast between modern constructivist mathematics has simply been consolidated through in though in a very unbalanced way. Some 99% of practicing mathematicians are modern. In 1905, commenting on the French debate, Hedemad wrote that there are two conceptions of mathematics, two mentalities in evidence. It has now come to be recognized that there is value in both approaches. They complement each other and can coexist peacefully. In particular, interest in effective methods, algorithms, and computational mathematics has grown markedly in recent decades, and all of these are closer to the constructivist tradition. The foundational debate left a rich legacy of ideas and results, key insights and developments, including the formulation of axiomatic set theory and the rise of intuitionism. One of the most important of these developments was the emergence of modern mathematical logic as a refinement of axiomatics, which led to the theories of recursion and computability around 1936. In the process, our understanding of the characteristics, possibilities, and limitations of formal systems was hugely clarified. One of the hottest issues throughout the whole debate, and probably its main source, was the question of how to understand the continuum. The reader may recall the contrast between the set theoristic understanding of the real numbers and Brouwer's approach, which rejected the idea that the continuum is built of points. That this is a labyrinth question was further established by results of Cantor's continuum hypothesis, which postulates that the cardinality of sets of real numbers is the second transitive cardinal or equivalent, that every infinite subset of real numbers must biject with either the natural numbers or the real numbers itself. Gödel proved in 1939 that the continuum hypothesis is consistent with the axiomatic set theory, but Cohn proved in 1963 that its independence of axioms. The problem is still live, with few mathematicians producing alternative approaches to the continuum and others trying to find new and convincing set theoretic principles which will settle Cantor's question. The foundation debate has also contributed in a definitive way to clarifying the peculiar style and methodology of modern mathematics, especially the so-called Platonism or existential character of modern mathematics, by which is meant a methodological trait rather than a supposed implication of metaphysical existence. Modern mathematics investigates the structures by considering their elements as given independently of human capabilities or effective definition and construction. This may seem surprising, but perhaps this trait can be explained by broader characteristics of scientific thought and the role played by mathematical structures in modeling of scientific phenomenon. In the end, the debate made it clear that mathematics and its modern methods are still surrounded by important philosophical problems. When a sizable amount of mathematical knowledge can be taken for granted, theorems can be established and problems can be solved with the certainty and clarity for which mathematics is celebrated. But when it comes to laying out the bare beginnings, philosophical issues cannot be avoided. The reader of these pages may have felt that in several places, especially in the discussion on intuitivism, but also in the basic ideas behind Hilbert's program, and of course in the problem of the relationship between formal mathematics and its informal counterpart, a problem that is brought up in sharp focus by Gödel's theorem. So great article. Good job, Jennifer, in sharing that.
I shared that.
You shared that with me just earlier today.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I hadn't finished it, just awesome.
Yeah, I don't know if to put in the terminology that I was using to say that mathematics is still not metaphysically grounded. And you could work in mathematics.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is arguably grounded in the Euclidean axioms or in the Zermelo-Frank axiom. So,
well,
you could argue
yeah,
that
it's grounded in something.
Well, I mean, it just depends if you're going to.
It's not sufficiently grounded, because what it's grounded in.
It's not under, like, the manner in which it's grounded, it's not framed as grounding. It's just framed as, here's the axioms and here's what you do with them. They don't say, okay, well, you have to ground everything, and now we're grounding math with these axioms. But I think it kind of is that, just unsaid. I've never seen it asserted by a math textbook that the axioms of Euclid ground the technology of geometry, for example. But I feel like that's true.
Well, I'm saying that. Well, I said that mathematics and geometry is grounded in the metaphysical definition of time, of space. And I mean, so scientifically,
Yeah,
so
that
like time,
I
space,
think I see what you're saying, but that's not a fact by any sense of the word.
that, if you talk like ontological independence, that science and mathematics does not achieve ontological independence, and it's dependent upon unknown primitives, and so you could work with it even though it's dependent upon undetermined primitives, or you could use
Ungrounded primitives.
undetermined primitives.
They are determined. It's the axioms,
No,
but
they're
they're
undetermined.
ungrounded.
No, I mean saying
They're
that it's not
determined
even
insofar
determined,
as that they're able to be expressed explicitly. That means they're determined. If they're able to be expressed in language, they're determined.
but the so to say
They're
the
just not grounded. Like, you can ask someone, what's the point of the parallel lines theorem? It's
you're
just
missing the
not
point that I'm
grounded.
saying. The primitives of mathematics necessitate some further primitive grounding,
No, they
and
don't.
the grounding that
No, they don't.
the
The
primitives that will
PSR
ground.
necessitates grounding. Some type of a foundationalist worldview necessitates grounding. Math doesn't necessitate grounding, if anything, because you can just say that it's ontology independent. If anything, math is ontology independent. You just say it doesn't matter what numbers are because they're relational definitionally. So it doesn't,
But it's not
their
I mean,
substance is irrelevant.
it's not
I'm not
ontologically.
saying anyone has even made this argument, but what
No
you're
one's
saying is
even
even more
no one's even
obscure than what I
claiming that
just
it's
said.
no one's even claiming that it's ontologically independent. There is someone that's shown that it's not ontologically independent.
The implicature is there when science doesn't want to talk about the substance of what it's measuring, just the process. It implies that it's possible to have ontological independence. A process can work regardless of ontology.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a process that works even though it's intrinsically based on indetermined primitives, and
Well, it depends. If you say that the
those indeterminate
validation comes
primitives
in
are
from the method
based on
if
metaphysics.
something is self-validated methodologically, then you don't have to make that metaphysical argument. You can just say, well, it's methodologically self-validated. It
But it's
stands
not.
on its own conclusions. I've heard that or similar arguments made for math. I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying that, I mean, nominalism does work in math. Like, you can calculate numbers without knowing what numbers are.
Well, I'm saying at this point, science is basically math.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that.
I mean, and science has even more indeterminate primitives than mathematics.
Not really if you take science to simply be a method of formulating hypotheses. I mean, if you take science to be just a pure method, it doesn't have an ontology either. There's just a supposed ontology, which is an intrinsic causal ontology, where it's like, yeah, if science is going to work, there has to be something that allows it to work. And yeah, call that
Well,
causality.
that's the Cartesian metaphysical framing of science in a mathematical framework of objects acting in space, and then Newton and time. Some of the Newtonian completion of the Cartesian metaphysics, that science is the mathematical laws of objects acting in space at times. And so the metaphysical primitives of the current Newtonian framework we operate in are objects, space, and time.
Well, the argument is that it can all be reduced to sets.
That's mathematics. By saying science
Well, the idea is that
has
physics
the
can be
further
explained with
primitives.
math. The idea is that physics can be explained with math, and math can be explained by sets. I'm not saying I agree, but that's the basic idea.
Yeah, so I mean,
Now, this is not my opinion, by the way. This is
science basically
state
has
of affairs.
four primitives here, and there are probably more. And logic is not one of them, but saying math.
Logic is not a, well, it depends if you're mixing up logic and causality. Because according to some definitions of logic, it's pretty much indistinguishable from causality.
Um, yeah, that's unclear. It's saying causality is part of ontology, not logic.
Again, logic is not a set definition. The context, the use, the meaning of the term depends whether it's a primitive and what kind of primitive it is. Some
Well,
people think logic is an
that's because you use
epistemological
these
primitive.
amorphous terms that become meaningless, like your use of logic and science.
I'm not the one who uses logos in a religion to try to bolster it.
Why I say you use an amorphous
Highly
definition to
incredulous.
make it inclusive of things which it's not inclusive of.
I'm not even talking about myself here. Like, you can't deny Hegel uses a proprietary definition of logic. Even people who claim to be in his orthodoxy and still use the term logic and differ from his interpretations in any way could be said to be using a different definition of logic.
Yeah, so when you formalize it,
I mean, by its own claims, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. So you can't have it both ways. There are ways that things can be described differently, and there's more than one source of data that generates a definition of that term, logic, because of computers and because of people thinking for themselves in a way that they tend to think of as logical, which just basically translates to like my own opinion or my own thought process. So it's sort of all over the place. Whether
yeah,
logic can be grounded is a metaphysical question.
yeah. So just to clarify,
Like
so
every logical, in my system, every logical thing has some type of metaphysical something. There's no such thing as logic without some type of metaphysics. It just doesn't exist because of non dualism.
okay, so just to clarify here, Newton's the current formalization when I use the word science in terms of the Western canonization of the Royal Society through Newton, the metaphysical primitives of science is space, time, and objects, and those are not defined within science themselves. They might have some form of definitions, but those are metaphysical primitives, and mathematics is, so to say, the language, but that's not defined from within science itself. Mathematics that science uses mathematics, but it's not self-defined mathematics. So mathematics is another primitive, and possibly you could consider the method of the empiricism, like Bacon in the method, as, I mean, it'd have to be another metaphysical, philosophical primitive. But you have at least 5 primitives to science that are dependent upon something else, that so that cannot self-define, that are defined from another field. So that's historically why science was a subfield of theology, that science did not define these terms. It wasn't thought that science would define these terms. And people today still talk about Platonism or dualism or monism, due to the realization that, I mean, when I read at the very beginning that Popper was talking about Kierkegaard and the elimination of philosophy, that science would hypothetically eliminate philosophy, but that seems like a fallacy, because science, if you parse it in the way that science will never be able to metaphysically ground itself, and philosophy is the larger field that grounds science, and then you have well, what grounds philosophy? And
Metaphysics.
well, it's a metaphysics is called part of philosophy.
Okay,
And
and
even
then what grounds that is theology.
Yeah, so what it means God. That like
Yeah, and
it's
then God is like one version of a. It's like the opposite end of a metaphysical primitive.
well, I mean, yeah, it's like the buck is passed in the sense that we could know things about space, time, objects within a field, the philosophical fields, ontology, metaphysics, epistemology. However, our knowledge is limited and it's grounded in something beyond us, so to say, God, or possibly a dualism. You could have a non-atheistic dualism, and whatever grounds object, space, and time, mathematics is of some sort of different nature that comes to the scientific method. So that's what we were talking about last week in the Marburg School of Neo-Kantianism. That is really a direct um, descendant from Bacon and the scientific method. So a deeper of Kant is a priori, or the Neo-Kantian Marburg school that was talking about the continuum, that you're never really going to know for sure. However, current scientific knowledge could be considered objective and an active description, even though it's only partial, and it's part of a continuum of discovery of more and more truth, but it'll always be on a continuum of partial truth. But that partial truth from the Marburg School of Neo-Kantianism could be considered true.
Could be considered true, as in it hasn't been disproven yet, and it seems to be rational.
No, but see, it's a um, objective, ontologically independent truth of reality. So if you say like the law of gravity, or various scientific laws that have been mathematized, tested, even though they might constantly be corrected, could be considered true ontologically independent pieces of knowledge, objective. And that only refers to, like I said, like Maxwell. So, and I still have the stuff on Maxwell and his analogies, but saying it's only his formulas that are truth in that sense. And even just like Maxwell's formulas are only partial truth, are on a continuum of knowledge, but those could currently be considered ontologically independent objective truth.
That's basically what the Kantian project is.
The Neo-Kantian Marburger School.
Okay. So I guess we have to make the next, you know, churn of the machine of science forward from there.
Well, you have to work with the current pieces of ontologically independent objective truth.
But my own methodology precludes ontological independence.
Well, yeah, then there's a dual use of saying that to some extent people whether there is such a thing as ontological independence versus saying a scientific law. Obviously, it has primitives. It's dependent. Scientific laws are dependent, but that was the question of when I was reading on ontological independence: are all truths dependent on all other truths? Are certain truths ontologically dependent? So if you say that, okay, Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism are ontologically dependent on a whole bunch of other things within mathematics and other scientific laws and metaphysical assumptions, but at the same time, the law itself could be considered an ontologically independent truth.
You can call anything an ontologically independent truth, but I'm not going to know what you're referencing other than something that doesn't exist in my
Well,
system.
no, so I mean, from the Neo-Marbians, you could only call proven mathematical, tested mathematical descriptions of nature ontological independent truths. Those are the only things that
Uh,
qualify as that,
so
like
like
gravity,
time and
like
space and whatnot, you mean?
no, those are primitives. Those aren't. So you're talking about like the dependence relationship. So science cannot define time and space and objects. It could just define the relationships between them. But the relationships between them are considered independent objective truths. They're obviously, I mean, they're dependent upon each other, and they're dependent on metaphysical primitives. However, the current state of scientific knowledge, only when you have mathematical formalizations that make predictions that have been tested, have this category that we'll call objective truths. And even those are only partial truths that are in the process of changing.
Well, I think there is such a thing as an objective truth, like
Well, you think that there's a lot more
mass.
objective truth than just scientific laws, mathematical relations. And I don't even know how you're claiming the metaphysical primitives like mass.
I'm not saying mass is not a metaphysical primitive in my system. Matter is. So there's a very restricted number of metaphysical primitives in my system.
So mass, the truth isn't mass. The truth, and I mean, my understanding, like the Neo-Marbian, Neo-Kantian Marburg school, the truth is the mathematic formulaic relationships between mass and other entities like gravity. So even gravity itself is a metaphysical primitive. However, to say that gravity equals mm divided by r squared, or the constant formula, that is the truth.
Well, you're sort of into a philosophical sort of ought we define truth as a element of physics, or perhaps truth is a theological concept and ought to remain in the domain of theology so as to minimize conflicts.
No, because I mean, truth doesn't have utility to it. I
Thinks
mean,
about it for 2 seconds. No.
truth
Okay.
is
Just
objective. It doesn't.
give it a chance. Give peace a chance.
I mean, you have a Judaic approach to truth. You say, well,
I've definitely heard that before.
where you say that truth is what's best for the Jews, or if you just say like, well, generic.
I'm saying it's better to understand truth as a theological notion rather than a scientific one because truth has a certain level of emotional baggage that science ought to reject.
Well, yeah, but that has to have a separate metaphysical, philosophical grounding that is much more difficult than scientific grounding.
What is
And to say that,
theological? Yeah, that's my whole point is to understand theology as like a bigger undertaking than just philosophy.
well, it's my system of dualism that science is exclusive to material properties. So science has nothing to say about non-material phenomenon like morality and ethics. So
So
is it
then
better?
science in your view maybe wouldn't be ontology independent because you're kind of
Well, I say
restricting it
the
what it
ahimsa
can say to
principle.
matter.
The ahimsa principle is non-scientific.
It depends on how you define science, because I could
Okay,
say,
in
well,
my system.
scientifically, that belief is what enables the best result, and I'd have a bunch of evidence to back it up. So depends how you define science.
Yeah,
Like
but there's no
if you're
best.
saying that there's some intrinsic goodness out there in the world called the ahimsa that's we can discover scientifically, that's not how it works.
Well, I say ahimsa is intrinsically non-scientific. It can't be measured and calculated.
You can measure
You could
the
apply
effect of that
mathematics.
belief. You can measure the effect of that belief indirectly.
I would say if I put in my system in a dualistic system, ahimsa is not talking about physical properties, talking about spiritual properties. So
Well,
it's not
most people would
scientific.
say there's a connection.
Science is only science only. It's from my personal ontology or philosophy that science is only to do with material phenomena.
Well, yeah, we have a materialist paradigm for like since Descartes.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the Galileo Descartes. So ironically, it was Descartes who separated science through his dualism, and now in the modern terminology, his non-materialist aspects have been eliminated. But so modern material science is Cartesian science because that's Descartes. So in that sense, I'm a Cartesian. Science only deals with material phenomena. So something like the ahimsa is intrinsically non-material. I mean, you could say that objects, in the same way that objects that operate in space and time are what suffer and are that where suffering is limited, or that physical interaction of bodies is what causes suffering. So not to say that there's no relationship between ahimsa and science, but that science does not have anything to say. I don't say anything to say, but they're parallel realms. So you just have to clarify these things. And if you have some sort of system, like if you're saying grounded, if you're say mental phenomena, like suffering is grounded in the material, and
Well, no, matter's grounded in
as
the
like a
mind. Wait,
physicalist.
matter's grounded in the mind. So there is no matter in my model. There's only mental processes.
Yes, and you have a difficult time clarifying science and
Because eventually it comes down to like, well, how ought words be defined? And it's not something people have thought about. Most people assume words have conventional definitions. You assume that, whereas clearly these definitions get adapted particular utilities by particular authors all the time. So it's one thing to call attention to the fact that like I just don't think I can explain the concept of definitional circularity in a way that makes the point. So yeah, it's really tough. Yeah, the comments in the chat are pretty good. Two pillars, even if it's illusory. Yeah, that's where the two truths doctrine comes from. So the idea with philosophy is we're kind of on the boundary of those two truths because they're not separate. They're just two ends of. They end up being pretty separate because it's just the stuff of conventional reality is just really uncontroversial. It's like, is this green or red? It's just so obvious. If you actually want a resolution, I mean, not everyone wants that, but then when you get into philosophy stuff, it's not. There are what amount to conventional definitions in philosophy, which is arguably like more towards the absolute truth end of things, but they aren't fixed, especially with something like metaphysics. Like, as you can see, this is pretty much on par with how I'm using the term, but they don't define it the way that I do at all. There's a lot more baggage, I guess. You didn't highlight this, did you?
No, but I just downloaded all of Crosby Smith's popular writer on the history of science. So he had a lot of stuff on energy. Um, a lot of it's pretty interesting. Let's put some of these links in the chat. Um, Here was also an interesting article. Maybe I'll read briefly from this one. Um, Ether and the Creation of Scientific Concepts, Concept Formation in Science, Nancy Nersessian. When we survey the history of science, no matter what our philosophical persuasion, it's clear that the formation of new ways of conceptualizing reality is a central feature of the scientific enterprise and of what we call scientific progress. However, little attention has been given to the study of how these new concepts are actually formed. Indeed, until the last 20 years or so, the question of how new concepts are formed in science has been relegated to the status of mere psychology and not even done by psychologists. Concept formation has been seen by philosophers as of such disparate views as Reichenbach, Popper, and Feyerabend as incapable of rational analysis, as evolving some creative leap, as matter of individual psychology, as lying within the context of discovery. The proper concern of philosophers is that of legitimating the new conceptual structures once they're formed. It lies within the context of justification. Historians, on the other hand, have worked quite steadily within the context forbidden to philosophers, but have not attempted to formulate theories about how concept formation takes place, with a few exceptions, even those historically oriented philosophers who have argued that certain aspects of discovery provide legitimate concerns for philosophers, have tended to focus on the transition from one completed theory to another. The general situation just characterized has, as I will argue, led to serious misconceptions concerning the way concepts are created in science. In this paper, I wish to examine some of the factors involving the formation of one scientific concept, electromagnetic field. I've chosen this particular concept because the formation of the field conception of forces has proven to be one of the most significant innovations in the 19th and 20th century physics. Its formation has also led to the alteration of many fundamental concepts. I will examine only the electromagnetic field and not the gravitational and quantum field concepts here, since the present conception of the field as a state of space is completed in the special theory of relativity. I will also only examine the works of Faraday, Maxwell, Lorentz, and Einstein, since their contributions were the most significant. I, of course, realize that more complete analysis would involve the work of others, Kelvin, but this is not necessarily for my purpose here. Stated most simply, the concept of the field involves the notion that continuous physical processes take place in the region surrounding the bodies and charges in question. In particular, the electric and magnetic states characterize points in the space around charges and magnets. The major issue in the early stages of the development of electromagnetic theory were, are there such processes, or are the actions transmitted at a distance? And if there are such processes, do they take place in the space free from all matter, ponderable or otherwise, or are they states of some material medium, ether, filling all spaces? The scientists considered here held that there are such processes and thus were concerned with the second question. They maintained that an adequate characterization of electric and magnetic action must include the notion of continuous transmission of the action through the intervening space. They believe that such a characterization is not simply a mathematical convenient way of describing the actions, as for example the Laplace potential field characterization was for gravitation. Rather, the electric and magnetic fields, as conceived by Faraday, Maxwell, Lorentz, and Einstein, have physical existence. They are present even when no test body is present to detect them. The major problem they faced is formulating the field concept was how or by what process such an entity could exist. In the solution of that problem, radical revision of the concepts occurred. The concepts of space, time, mass, and indeed physical itself were altered to accommodate the dual conception of reality, matter, and field. In the following sections, I address specific problems encountered and methods utilized by each scientist in his attempt to formulate the concept of field. From an examination of this case, it appears the concept formulation in the science is a process which divides in three stages. I call these three stages heuristic guide, elaboration, and philosophical. Although the specific details of each case will vary, these stages do seem to characterize the important components of each formation in science generally. In stage A, the new way of conceptualizing the phenomenon in question is introduced primarily by borrowing analysis of similar problems in related or unrelated fields and or insights from those fields. These are used in heuristic guides to explore new conceptual possibility. In the physical science, this will primarily involve the use of analogy, but need not in general. In stage B, the new conception is accepted as a fruitful way of comprehending the phenomenon in question, and methods of analysis appropriate to the discipline are used to elaborate, clarify, and extend it. In physics, this usually involves a highly rigorous mathematical analysis, but in other scientists and the more experimental fields of physics, it may primarily involve experimentation and or the collecting of more empirical data. In stage C, the now highly developed conception is subjected to rigorous critical scrutiny. The foundations upon which the conception rests are reassessed, leading to varying degrees of clarification and reformulations of those foundations and thereby to the concept. These stages should be taken as simply providing a general schema within which to discuss the concept formation in science. They will be elaborated more completely with respect to the concept of field in the following sections. However, some possible apprehensions of the reader should be allayed at this point. First, I do not claim that these stages occur at separate times. There can be, and usually is, interaction. These stages are successive, though B cannot occur before A, but it's possible to tentatively advance to the next stage and return to the techniques of an earlier stage when certain types of problems arise. Second, the transition from one stage to another may take place within the theory of one scientist or may span several generations and theories. It would be highly unusual, though, for a concept to be taken through all the stages in the work of one scientist. Third, the introduction of or significant alteration in a concept may occur in a false theory, as is the case here. Finally, the ultimate refinement mentioned in stage C is not meant as necessarily the final or last word on the matter. We can only judge retrospectively at what point a concept receives its ultimate formulations. For example, from the perspective of pre-relativistic physics, the concept of mass had received its final formulation. The process of articulating ways of conceptualizing reality is an ongoing enterprise in science, and our concepts are interconnected. An accepted formulation of concept may be altered in some unforeseen way in a future theory, or it may keep that meaning but be eliminated from our description of reality. In the final section, I discuss the relevance of the example developed here for the most influential philosophical views of concept formation in science. Throughout this introduction, the expression concept formation has been used rather than conceptual development. This has been in order to avoid begging the issue between the continuous development view of positivist and neo-positivist philosophers and the discontinuous no development view of Kuhnian philosophers. I refer to these views retrospectively as the orthodox and the radical views of the nature of concept formation in science. They can be characterized as follows. The orthodox position is that the conceptual development is continuous and cumulative. The radical position is that the concepts do not develop but arise in a discontinuous manner, completely replacing former concepts in such a way that there is no incommensurability of meaning between one period and the next in science. What the following analysis reveals is that neither of these views adequately characterize the formation of the concept of field. Both are too simplistic. Rather, there is commensurable development of the concepts, but is not simply cumulative. So I recommend reading this whole article, and it talks about lines of force and the arisal of the field. And as mentioned multiple times earlier, that one of the key parts of that was the full development of the Laplacian calculus and the eigenvectors to have the full vector field mathematics of differential equations. But I thought that was an interesting conception on science related to what we've been talking about.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a tough concept.
I have a few more. So here, something Jennifer is always mentioning, and the concept of models and analogies. But Jennifer's usually talking about models. We get Doovid's got some female authors for today. Models in classical physics. Questions about the structure and justification of theories, the interpretation of data, and the problem of realism have been at the forefront of the debate in recent philosophy of science, and the topic of models and analogies increasingly recognized as integral to this debate. Models of physical matter in motion, for example, models of atoms and planetary systems were already familiar in Greek science, but serious analysis of models as a concept entered philosophy of science only in the 19th century. This was largely the result of the proliferation in classical physics of theoretical entities such as atom, electromagnetic wave, and electron, for which there appeared to be no directly observable evidence. Yeah, I put the link in the chat if you want to read along. The sense of model discussed in classical physics were of two types, which may be distinguished as material and formal. A material model is or describes a physical entity. Familiar examples are billiard balls, fluid medium, a spring, or an attracting or repelling electric particle. A formal model is an expression of the form of the structure of physical entities and process without any semantic content referring to specific objects or properties. For example, a wave equation of mathematical symbols may express the laws of simple pendulum or of sound and light waves, of quantum wave functions, while remaining neutral to any specific applications. Another example is the formal structure of a computer program, software which may be realized in a number of different hardware setups and has provided useful formal models of brain structure and artificial intelligence. Formal models are syntactic structures, material models are semantic in that they introduce reference to real and imaginary entities. Analogy will be taken here to refer to some relation or similarity and or difference between a model of the world, or less question begging between a model and some theoretical description of the world, or between one model and another. Models are relata of analogy relations. That is, a model is an analogy. Analogy relations themselves may be formal or material. They may be merely analogies of structure, such as that between a light wave and a simple pendulum, or they may introduce material similarities, as when gas particles are held to be like billiard balls and all mechanical properties relevant to Newton's laws. Analogy relations, like similarity, come in degrees and in different respects, and are therefore not generally transitive. This makes rigorous treatment difficult, but it's useful for a start to distinguish three types of material analogy relation: positive, negative, and neutral. A positive material analogy picks out those features of the analogies that are identical or strongly similar. A negative analogy picks out those known to be different or strongly dissimilar. A neutral analogy picks out those for which there is no evidence yet as to similarity or dissimilarity. For example, DNA models built of painted balls and metal struts are positively analogous to DNA molecules in spatial structure and connectedness, but negatively analogous in size, material, shape, and color of the constituents. These models have neutral analogy with molecules insofar as their further detailed properties are used to explore and yet unknown features of genetic material. The dividing line between these sorts of analogy will, of course, shift as research goes forward. The better the model, the more of the neutral analogy will eventually be accepted as positive, whereas poor model will become more and more negatively analogous. So much for the somewhat rough definitions that suffice for the description of models in classical physics and chemistry. Models serve there to introduce unobservable entities and processes into physical theory by analogy with familiar observable entities and processes, thus providing pictures of the explanatory entities held to underlie phenomenon. The problem of justifying these explanatory models led to a polarization of epistemological views. Realists held that successful models are positive analogies of the real world. Positives denied the realities of the theoretical entities referred to and regarded models as merely working pictures to be dispensed with in accepted theories, having at best formal analogy with the world. The philosophical debate about models was initiated by Campbell, 1920, and the course of the critique of so-called hypothetico-deductive theory of theories. According to this view, of which Maxwell's electromagnetic theory is a paradigm case, planetary theory in physics consists of a set of mathematical equations, some but not all of the terms of which are interpreted by means of directly observable or measurable properties such as shape, position, momentum, time interval, weight, texture, color, light intensity, temperature, etc. These interpretations were called bridge principles or the dictionary. A theory is confirmed if, with the bridge principles, laws and predications can be deduced and shown to give a good fit with the experimental explananda. If the fit is poor, the theory is disconfirmed or refuted. If the positive version of hypothetical deductive models are used only as aids to discovery and are not logically essential part of the theory. Campbell argued, on the contrary, that models are interpretations of unobservable terms, are essential elements of a theory, because merely mathematical formalism gives no meaningful information other than that contained in the experimental laws and properties themselves. Taking the billiard ball model of gases and his main example, he showed how the experimental laws are explained, unified, and made intelligible by this model, and most importantly, how theoretical inference proceeds by modification and extension of the model to give new predictions. The logic of such inference is analogical argument from the properties of the model's familiar source, observable mechanical particles, to the explanandum gases. For example, the original point model of particles that explain Boyle and Charles' laws is extended to particles of finite size, thus predicting the corrections to Boyle's laws which are necessary to obtain greater experimental range and accuracy for real gases. Thus, models are shown to be essential to arguments in physics, not merely dispensable heuristic devices. Two kinds of issues arise from this analysis, one epistemological and the other ontological. Campbell has an explicit epistemological thesis in his argument for the essentiality of models, namely, they justify reliance on predictions from models in virtue of the known positive analogy between model and explanandum. That there is such reliance was pointed out by Putnam in a striking example from the construction of the first atomic bomb. Although laboratory-sized tests of the nuclear reaction involved had been performed successfully, large-scale tests had not, and their failure would have been catastrophic. Such tests would not have been carried out unless there had been some intuitive confidence that analogical extrapolations from evidence and theory justified expectation of success. Underlying all such intuitions, there is a metaphysical and the analogy of nature, and this brings with it ontological questions about the status of models. If the kinetic model, for example, has no relation to the real analogies in nature beyond those already observed, there is no basis for prediction to its analogical extrapolations. Does this imply, however, that there are molecules as described in the theory? Campbell's reply to this question was subtle. The model of molecules is not identical with the substructure of gases, only materially analogous to it. Models are entities which share the properties of mechanical properties insofar as these are required to explain already known phenomenon and to predict phenomenon yet to be examined, but analogies have negative elements and realistic identifications of models with nature is therefore unjustified. Campbell then was anti-realist about the theoretical entities and some of their first order properties, but realist about their positive analogy relations. I thought you might like this one.
Why? Because of the realist anti-realist divide?
Well, and it's talking about models. It's separate
Cool.
from the this one's semi-short. I'm not sure if you want me to go on.
I think we mostly have the gist of it. Can read more. People are interested. It's pretty dry though.
Yeah, so I put that one in the chat. Some more studious people. This one's pretty long, but I'll at least read the summary. Even the introduction's 5 pages. Faraday's concept of force is described by 6 assumptions. These specify a concept that is quite distinct from mechanical conceptions of his contemporaries and interpreters. Analysis of the role of these assumptions clarify Faraday's weighting and experimental evidence and show how closely linked Faraday's chemistry and physics were to his theology. It is argued that Faraday was unable to secularize his concept of force by breaking the ties between his physics and his theology of nature. Examination of the basic assumptions also explained Faraday's failure to quantify his principle of conservation of force, his rejection of mechanical conceptions of force and energy, and his early attempt to develop a wave model for the conservation and transmission of electricity, magnetism, light, and heat. So, if you don't mind, I'll read some of this introduction too.
Sounds good.
Faraday insisted on the separation of religion and science and on the priority of experiment, but it is well known that this natural philosophy expressed certain theological precepts. This natural philosophy, which derived from English Newtonian natural philosophy, is generally believed to have been contemporarily to contem- complementary to his natural theology. I will argue that the complementarity had another aspect. Although some of his precepts did originate in his theology of nature, the close link between theology and physics constrained the development of Faraday's concept of force. This led him to reject the new mechanical concept of force, work, and energy developed by Joule, Thomson, and others during the 1840s and 50s. Faraday's rejection of the new mechanical philosophy was not due to his misunderstanding the new ideas, but was part his resistance to a separation of natural science from theology, a separation implied by what he saw as the materialistic tendencies of mechanical approaches to the study of nature. Faraday's defenses of the ontological primacies of force and the conservation of force expressed his resistance to the secularization of natural science at a time when its relationship to religious belief was being redefined. I shall describe Faraday's doctrine of force as a set of six assumptions in order to show how the course of his researches was governed by them and to identify those metaphysical precepts originating in his theology of nature. It will then be possible to see why Faraday did not attempt to put his belief in the conservation of force onto a quantitative footing and why he resisted the new mechanical philosophy, particularly Joule's interpretation of conservation processes in terms of work as a measurement of mechanical effect, a discovery that Thomson describes as having led to the greatest reform that physical science has experienced since the days of Newton. So this goes back to what I was talking about last week and what I consider the second major epoch in the development of science is the conservation of energy, and like Helmholtz and Maxwell and Faraday is a big part of it. However, Helmholtz, as we talked about last week, also wanted to talk about the unifying principles, the conservation of force, not energy. And Faraday also was that school of wanting to unify the principle of around force and not energy. So this article is interesting because it was saying it's theological. Instead of pursuing the problem of quantifying conservation processes, Faraday repeatedly fell back on the first principles either of teleological economy or the indestructibility of force. These are sometimes supported by explicit appeals to divine providence, but theology became more direct constraint because the new concepts of work and energy threatened to divest force of the metaphysical connotations necessary to Faraday's theology of nature. John Herschel also rejected the mechanical doctrine for similar reasons. Force linked intellect with matter, underlying the intelligibility of the material creation. Faraday could not secularize his physics, that is, he could not give up on the idea as force is the essential constituent of the natural order, a source of all possible actions and events in nature, which expressed and was sustained by the power of God. Science was the study of natural powers. Its objective was to discover the laws of the transformation of force as a means to the understanding and control of a natural order created by God for man. Faraday's resistance to the new doctrine of energy conservation was not merely a rejection of physical arguments that persuaded others, nor simply a rejection of the mathematical complexities of the new physics. It was his response to the larger threat of the whole framework of his understanding of the science and creation, posed as much by the changing status of science as by the change within it. Thus, he did not contribute to the discussions in which the concepts of force and energy were defined. This shows that theology of nature could circumscribe the naturalistic approach, even of one as dedicated to experiment as Faraday was. Historical accounts of the changing relationship between theology and the physical science in the early 19th century should recognize this factor. Faraday's belief about the nature of force changed little during his career and left him unprepared for the developments that were overtaking him in the 1840s. Neither these differences between his conception and those of the mechanical approaches, nor the theological basis of his resistance to the aspects of these approaches, have been sufficiently recognized in the literature. This is partially because the nebulous character of his verbal accounts permits the interpretation of his work in terms of the later development of it by Maxwell and others. But to clarify Faraday's ideas in terms of mechanical concepts begs the very question of their equivalence. To examine only those ideas that were successfully adopted is to obscure an aspect of his thought which, despite its exclusion from physics by the mid 19th century, remains important to the understanding of his science and its context. Faraday's force is central to a natural philosophy in which it was not possible to reduce force to mechanical force without abandoning other assumptions central to his science and his theology. This will become apparent when the ambiguities of his concept are confronted. In section 2, I identify six main assumptions that emerge from Faraday's verbal discussions. Evidence of for this outline structure is given in section 3, where I show how these assumptions guided Faraday's major researches between the 20s and 50s, and specifically why Faraday failed to discover magnetic induction during the 1820s, why he never attempted to measure exact equivalent effects for any of the conversion processes he studied, that Faraday failed to make certain distinctions that were crucial to the development of mechanical concept of work and energy, that this was due partly to his use of an undulatory model for the conservation and transmission of different forces, including heat, and partially to his reliance on the idea of economy in nature. This interpretation also explains Faraday's weighting of experimental results and of certain theoretical problems. Evidence of the theological constraints of his thought appears mainly in unpublished notes of his lectures at the Royal Institution. In section 4, I discuss these later in expositions in which he rejects mechanical concepts in favor of his unified physico-chemical science of force. This interpretation departs from previous treatment of Faraday's natural philosophy at several points. First, I show that far from accepting Maxwell's restatement of his position in 1857, Faraday rejected it, and for the same reasons that he rejected Joule's argument for the convertibility of heat and work. Second, I established that Faraday held the principle of conservation from the 1830s, long before such a principle is usually attributed to him, and that this principle had an a priori status derived from his natural philosophy. Third, I argue that he entertained a wave model of light and heat perhaps a decade before a public announcement of the idea in his Rave Vibrations lecture of 1846, and they saw this model as the only interpretation that satisfied both his observation and his principles. These departures imply further points. Faraday could not have progressed from knowledge of conversion processes to the idea of energy conservation because his natural theology required a different conception based on the principle of economy. There is a considerable continuity of development of Faraday's theory of matter and force, a continuity underwritten by his theology of nature, whose influences was greater than that of matter theorists. Reconstructionists of Faraday's work as a purely metaphysical research program are incomplete because they overlook the theological origins of certain precepts. They distort Faraday's weighting of evidence in conceptual problems. It will be misleading to treat theological sources of Faraday's metaphysical beliefs solely as constraints, for these also made positive contributions to the development of his field physics. His emphasis on force as an expression of divine will is one well-known consequence. Another is his phenomenalistic approach, namely to his determination to deal solely with the facts as experienced and not as reconstructed according to the needs of mathematical analysis. This has not previously been linked to his theology of nature. Here, the evangelical aspect of his theology is important because it emphasized experience. Study the books of nature was a source for the revelation of God's work to man. Faraday's theology would have been at least as important a source for his phenomenalistic approach as the inductive method of his day. His well-known distrust of imagination and hypothesis, his opposition to Ampere's interpretation of the Oersted effect, and later to Weber and Plucker's interpretation of diamagnetism, his distrust of the mathematical a prioritism that he saw as the structural theories of any kind, and his consequent rejection of central force physics all gained support from this aspect of his theology. The source of his conviction was the phenomenon must be explained in terms of representations of the actual appearances and behaviors, also explained the importance that he attached to the lines of force and the most direct representation of force. Faraday's religious beliefs justifies natural philosophy while governing his context as an experimentalist in Nature School. So encourage people to read the whole article. So what say you?
It's good. My focus is waning a little bit. I apologize. It's quite hot here.
Okay, well, do you want to wrap up, or did you want me to
I
sign
was
off?
I was hoping you had your own writing to go through.
Um, well, I have four more links, so if you're losing focus,
Well, you've been
I'll
reading
just
a lot from all the links, which is great and it's super in depth. It's just if stuff's not presented systematically, it's hard for me to know what to focus on.
well, I'm trying to systematically go at the same issue. So, this week I'm focusing on the metaphysical grounding and primitives, and specifically covering uh, the conservation of energy. So last week I talked more about thermodynamics and mechanical energy. So this week I was focusing more on electromagnetism and like Faraday and Maxwell. So I actually had uh, three things on Maxwell that I don't have to read through them. They're similar to Faraday in terms of the methodology and role of models and metaphysical precursors, and Maxwell's use of analogy, specifically for lines of force related to electromagnetism, and the eventual derivation of the um, important Maxwell equations based on the Laplacians. The Laplacian operator is another article on um, Maxwell's use of analogies. So I said Maxwell was quite an interesting person, like the Kathy Loves Physics stuff that I shared on, his Maxwell had written on Faraday's lines of force. So Faraday was not able to develop, his ideas. That Maxwell was the one who finished Faraday's development of his ideas. Mainly, one of the main reasons because Faraday was focusing on the conservation of force as opposed to energy. Um, so these are all interesting articles. This one also um, on Maxwell's paper. So I'll just put these in the chat if anyone's more studious listening to it. Um, and a connection between, like a focus on metaphysical uh, grounding primitives and the transition from models to mathematical formulation. And here was another one on um, William Thomson, the creation of thermodynamics, 1840 to 1855. If so, all of these are really important. I mean, we could come back to them. These are issues I'm really focusing on. Um,
Uh huh.
so,
Grounding. Do you understand how I solved the grounding problem? I'm still not sure. You can actually get off the ground
well,
of understanding anything.
you say like, I mean, your terminology is difficult for me because if you're gonna say that your approach to grounding, because I would say, like the article that I read, that the grounding remains unsolved. So, if if you're making a preposterous claim that you've solved the problem, as opposed to your approach to it or something like that. Like,
Well, there isn't a single solution for grounding. So, not even my system suggests that there's a single grounding solution. There's just different, I suppose, approaches to grounding. And I suppose I could put forward some conventions on grounding. Right? No? Yes? I don't know. That was my original sort of thought on the matter. But you're saying something more along the lines of I should find out who in history I agree most with in terms of their views on these topics, or something along those lines, perhaps. Did you want to answer or no?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer. So I mean, if you're saying like, I mean, if you just want me to like repeat or put in my own
Do
words,
you or do you not want me to situate my opinion alongside a historical context of other opinions on the matter?
um, were you saying right now? I mean, if that's what you want to do. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if you wanted to write a paper, like that's saying that's the due diligence. That's the method of a scientific paper. Like if you, I mean, you're not required to have your own theory of grounding. You're saying if you do have your own theory of grounding, you want to publish it. That's
I have a physical theory of grounding, sure, but
you
it's
know,
not a
I don't think
theory of grounding. It's sort of tricky though because words are, how do we define words and whatnot? So that sort of has to come into it. If you're gonna have a grounding approach, you have to account for the transition between like non-coherent and coherent, I think. So yeah. These these publications you gave are really good, and I would struggle to write something like that because it just seems really far away from what I think, and I also sometimes struggle to understand what it means. Not for lack of trying, just the number of words that aren't defined, that could be defined multiple ways that I'm aware of, that aren't specified, makes it hard to follow. Sort of wondering if anyone even reads these things uncontextualized, like with after, what are they called, like commentaries. Not having gone to school for this stuff, I'm not actually sure how it works out. Did you want to go over any of your writing, or did you have any, or not really?
Yeah, I don't have any writings. This I had um I had made some edits and revisions on my essay, but I didn't show it to my mom yet. So maybe I'll do some more and publish it. I was going to try to write a quick essay even by Friday. Um, that might be more practically useful than my blog because I would be writing for other people, and that's chess is a pedagogical tool, a preaching prop, and I just have a tiny note card that but I think I could turn
Can you
this
just
into
repeat what you just said?
chess is a pedagogical tool.
Okay. I was
I
wondering if there was a for something, like is the chess teaching
well, this would be
particular
for.
skill?
I mean, I coach chess at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I'm the assistant to the person who's uh, the head of chess for all of Detroit public schools. In fact, after school programs, including robotics and a few other after school programs, but mostly chess. So but I just do it at the Detroit Institute of Arts that has kids from most of the major schools in Detroit. And so like there's tens of coaches that come there regularly. So I mean there's these last weeks we've been getting like 50 kids a week, and maybe like half of them are the same every week. And so I would be writing this for other chess coaches specifically. And so I was just thinking, this last week I was working with a few young students, and I was explaining to young kids, like maybe 8 years old, basic concepts. And I was asking them if they knew, these words and what they meant. And most of them didn't really know. Some of them had heard the words, but you didn't really know what they meant.
If they're 5, they'll say yes, and then you can say what, and then they'll be like, I don't know. It's super cute. I'm guessing they're older than that, though.
Well, I mean, sometimes they're 5. Most of them are third grade. Most of them, I mean, some of them are even in high school, but you're from like 8 to 18. But a lot of times, like they come in, so I'll work with kids that are younger in like the 8 to 12 range. But I work with all through elementary through high school. So like occasionally younger. Um, and so I have to review, like I still, like if I do my self formation, like the Piaget theory of mental cognitive development. So I had a few terms that I thought I would show how, I use the term chess as a preaching prop. So I was going to write it. I was going to call it a pedagogical tool. But like, in Detroit, a lot of
And
people
then you
are,
could say pedagogical tools are like a preaching prop, maybe.
well, because like African Americans in Detroit are extremely Christian. And and it's not in the public schools, it's at the Detroit Institute of Arts. So I usually use the term preaching prop. I say chess is a preaching prop. So the main thing, really, like I'm preaching to the kids about life lessons, and I'm just using chess to do it. So like I'm teaching, I'm a extremely good chess player, like relatively people are excited, like kids. I've relatively long lines of kids that want my chess coaching, um, and I produce good results, like even state champions regularly. We have a whole team of coaches. But I was saying, my perspective, chess isn't like chess is just a tool, and it's really the preaching prop to teach karma, so to say. And so I was going to write the essay, Chess is a Pedagogical Tool. I talk a little bit about preaching prop, and I'll mention that in a non-denominational way, and even in a secular way, that all the things I'm mentioning don't have to be religious in nature. And most
I
of
would say that you should say it's a game that you're using as a tool.
well, I'm coaching chess as a method to give back. And
Chess
so
is
it's like,
fundamentally a game, and you're using it. I wrote down real quick, like it's a medium which can generate metaphors for life lessons. Chess, that is. What do you think?
yeah, so most of what I'm talking here are extremely basic, and they're not really religious. So I was just mentioning that I originally was like chess is a preaching prop, and preaching prop is usually when I speak to parents or coaches, I use the word purposely preaching prop. And a lot of the people are pretty devout Christians. So usually they appreciate the terminology. In other places, but like preaching prop, like what do you mean? Like if it's like, more like T jump or something, like secular, but like African Americans in Detroit, I mean, not all of them. There's some, but your religion is very popular. Like I think Detroit has like one of the highest percentages in the nation for weekly church attendance or things like so. By that, but it's not specific to like preaching. So let me just say some of these words: uh, goal, progress, coordination, efficiency. Those are the main terms week after week. So like with kids, I mentioned young kids. So I'll say like, have you ever heard the word coordination? Do you know what coordination means? And you like goal, progress, efficiency. So if the kid is like 8 years old, they probably know, they probably heard these words, goal and progress. They may be able to define loosely. Coordination and efficiency, sometimes they know the word, but they won't be able to define it. So this last week I was teaching a kid and he was like part of a dance team. So he's like, oh, coordination like dance, where like all and he couldn't say the term, but what I said was like, oh, like when all the people do the same body movement at the same time. That's called coordination. Um, so in chess, you get better by learning piece coordination because you start with 16 pieces and you have to focus on using multiple pieces towards the same purpose. So, um, so chess is a pedagogical tool, preaching prep. I think there were four main concepts that I thought are extremely useful for children in terms of definitely academics. Like a lot of people, they like, this young kid who was like, I get all A's. I two kids, even the kids were like bringing in their report cards and like, I got all A's. Very excited about it. And but not necessarily all the case. There's a lot of kids who like chess that aren't academic and don't like studying and don't perform well in school also, but like chess because of strategic thinking. But I mean, I think these are general because a lot of the people I'm writing this for are not really chess players. They're public school teachers who use chess in order to motivate their kids. So that this is more for not for chess coaches, but for teachers who use chess, um, most often with math. Sometimes you'll find like social studies or history teachers, but most often people who like coach chess teams are math and geometry teachers. But um, maybe like half of chess coaches are math and geometry teachers, but full other half of chess coaches come from other fields. There's one woman that's a history teacher, that's a chess coach, and sometimes you have like gym teachers that also coach chess because strategy is universal. Um, but these were concepts that I noticed that I was able to explain to kids. Kids understood the concept through chess, and hopefully it will benefit them in all aspects of their life. And so something like, well, what is a goal? So in chess, the goal is checkmate. And then also, I guess there'd be um, steps, progress. So a lot of times when a kid, like, I don't know how much you know about chess. Uh, so usually I do like basic exercises like mating with a king and queen versus king. And because it's like one of the simplest methods to teach these concepts. And so a lot of times they're, just moving the pieces back and forward. And I'm like, well, you're not making progress. And so the concept is like, well, the goal, in order to checkmate, um, first you have to get the king to the side of the board. Then you have to get your king in opposition to the opponent's king. And then you can deliver checkmate. So if they're just moving the pieces back and forth, they're not making progress towards forcing the king towards the side of the board. So it's a common thing. You're not making progress. But I said that. So I was going to write the essay with a brief explanation. Chess is a pedagogical tool, preaching prop, and how certain useful concepts to children for education could be taught through specifically goal, progress, coordination, and efficiency. So in terms of efficiency, once the kid has, say, mastered one of the drills, like mating with a king and queen, or king and rook, king and two bishops, certain techniques, you could do it in the most efficient way. So they might, know how to checkmate with a king and queen, but it takes them an average of 25 to 30 moves. When in reality, like if you do it most efficiently, you could do it like 10 to 15 moves. So the concept of efficiency and certain moves that will both moves will lead to checkmate, but one method cuts it in half. Uh, so I thought that I was going to try to write a quick essay, maybe just 2 or 3 pages, and then I would try to distribute it to a few of the chess coaches. And so that I thought I would try to do that by Friday, because there's a big tournament the next week and Cincinnati. So I thought if I tried to get it to a few of the coaches by Friday, maybe they would be able to put some use to it, and it might create a different direction in my writing, to kind of just like randomly writing. But I would actually be writing as a way to express useful information to people who would use it.
That's great.
And yeah, I'm not sure so much like if I later, like I wrote the essay on like what is the meaning of chess, and from a spiritual approach, but I could also maybe also write about moral and ethical concepts. I might even include it. um like I wrote the essay on candidate moves and um decision trees, but maybe certain moral, like thinking from the other person's perspective, and like the method of exhaustion, and looking at all possible options. And there's another
I
concept
wrote
of
an article about that, probably more garbage gibberish, a really long time ago.
there's another concept we call like a forced move, in certain situations where your person really only has one option. um, but I think I might just stick to these 4 concepts of goal, progress, coordination, and efficiency. And you try to write a quick 2-3 page essay for Friday. But I didn't start on that yet. And I was gonna take to my mom today a printout of my essay, but I forgot to print it out. So maybe I'll even print it out now. And
Awesome. So, goal, progress, coordination, and efficiency. And these are 4 pillars of using chess as a pedagogical tool, or these are the 4 pedagogies of chess.
no, there's just basic concepts. Chess is a pedagogical tool, so I'll give a basic explanation of why chess could be used to teach basic concept, and then I'll give an example of 4 basic concepts: progress, goals, efficiency, and coordination. That those are universally useful concepts for children to learn, and chess is an extremely good way to teach those concepts.
So, chess teaches concepts that have a more general range of applicability.
That's why I say chess is a pedagogical tool. That the
Oh,
point, I'm
okay.
not teaching chess to teach chess. Like I do teach chess to teach chess. Like, well, Doovid, can you teach me how to improve my chess game?
I think what you mean is that it's virtuous, not a pedagogical tool, because a pedagogical tool is something you use to teach someone about something else. So you have to say it's like a pedagogical tool for something else, problem solving maybe, or
Well, I'm just
management efficiency.
gonna leave it open. I mean, chess is the pedagogical tool. I'm gonna give
Yeah,
an
that's
example.
exactly the problem with grounding. You've been like, it's so funny that you've been telling me about grounding for so much, but you're not even thinking about grounding your own assertions. Like, I don't even think stuff's coherent if it doesn't have a biconditional determinacy. So in my system, to say that something is a pedagogical tool is actually nonsensical, because it has to be for some, it would have to be a tool for some particular lesson, not just like there are no tools absent the lessons that they impart.
Yeah, I'm not sure what sense you're making. I'm just like, pedagogical tools are designed to convey important lessons and allow people to improve their understandings
Yeah, but
of the problem
what
undertaken.
kind of lessons? It's not specific enough.
It doesn't have to be specific. It's a
So
pedagogical
then
tool.
how is it any different from math or spelling?
Well, they could be. I mean, you could probably. I mean, it wouldn't
I
be.
just don't see why you wouldn't want to be more specific if you could be specific, because to me these are pretty specific concepts.
Yeah, that's why. Maybe I'll call chess as a pedagogical tool, basic concepts, and
For basic concepts, and again, would be what kind of basic concepts in what field, because not all fields have the same basic concepts in those fields. The idea is that we can't really assume that anything off the bat, so we want to make assumptions that are reasonable where we have to make them.
yeah, I'm not sure if you're. I'm not sure your advice is meaningful, and saying that. I mean, I think they'll understand if chess is a pedagogical tool. I'm writing this for mostly um, high school, middle school, elementary school teachers, and I think it's self-explanatory that
Well, everybody thinks that their own intuitions are self-explanatory.
I mean, pedagogical is maybe like a technical term. So I was going to call chess as a preaching prop, but then I
Sure.
just
I still think you're going to be coming into the same problem, is like, what is the substance of what you're preaching? And I don't think that chess is a lesson independent preaching modality. It can convey certain lessons, and I don't know how specific you can describe those lessons, but I think you can get further than nothing.
well, so that's why pedagogical tool. That say chess is a preaching prop. The point is to preach life lessons. Chess is a pedagogical tool. The purpose is more um, to teach basic learning skills concepts. So that's what this one I was going to focus not on really you're preaching life lessons, but on basic concepts like progress goal, coordination, efficiency, and then maybe relate how those
Yes, you
concepts.
could say it's a pedagogical tool for conveying these four concepts.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I need to lengthen my title. I'm not that worried about it. Like it's like just chess is a pedagogical tool. It's a nice short, uh, explanatory title.
Sure.
I don't think I need
I
some like.
hope in the text you explain what it is a pedagogical tool for. That's all. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm writing this to more to give to a handful of chess coaches. So it's somewhat informal. I'm not like publishing a paper. I'm just going to hand something to some chess coaches I know.
Yeah, so you'll add that part if you think it's valid. I guess you don't see any value to that. Daryl agrees with you. Chess is an approach to teaching. I guess to me, it's like saying, well, an abacus is an approach to teaching. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's like, is poker an approach to teaching? Not really. Is dice an approach to teaching? Not really. But so, we'll see how it shakes out, and maybe you'll figure out a way to word it so that it all makes sense and whatnot. It sounds like a great thing to talk about. I'd be interested to read it. So yeah, look forward to that. You said you'll probably have it by Friday, so you'll have it by the next week in review. Yeah, I guess that would make sense. And then I guess we can go over it if you want, if you manage to finish it.
Yeah, it may not have any relevance to week in review, but I might write it.
Dark Matter says, "Are jackhammers an approach to teaching?" I have to leave that one for the philosophers. So yeah, I have shared everything that I have. I just put a couple of little images that I made, and hopefully I'll have some writing to share next week. I don't want to make any promises though, because it goes at whatever speed it's going, but it does feel like it's progressing forward. Daryl says, chess can teach what coordination means. It's a pedagogy. Okay. Well, I guess so is poker then, because it can teach you how to read read people's tells. There you go. So there's obviously a huge amount of like, if you're taking a purely logical approach, a huge amount of laxity with which terms could be defined. I suppose you could define them any which way. It'd just be probably impractical if it contradicted anything, or if it was completely off base from what everybody else meant. So, plus, after a while, it's like, why are you using so many proprietary definitions? What's the point? It doesn't seem to be much of a point, or good justification to use a proprietary definition, unless there's some like special cause for it, which would have to sort of be justified. But anyway, I guess that presupposes that language conveys meaning in the first place, and as we all know, there's issues with that. So, do we have anything to look forward to for Doovid fans for this coming week?
No, I don't. I don't plan on streaming this week.
All right, great. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up for now then. Unless you want to say something else.
No, no, thanks. So,
Great. Well,
God bless. Have a great week.
We'll
You
see you
can stay
next
on, I guess,
Monday.
if you want to keep on talking and.
Oh, I
sign
don't
off.
think I have much else to say. I'll just say bye to the chat. And is Monday good for you? And I guess everyone in the chat, let us know in the comments if Monday doesn't work. I don't think we had as many viewers as normal, but that's probably more because of the stream dropping out halfway through rather than the day change. So hopefully this is okay. Alternatively, we could, put it on a different day. I don't know what you think, Doovid, if any other day is okay for you. We haven't decided for sure if we're doing Mondays from now on, but it's something on my end that I can't do Sundays anymore. So that's because of me. But yeah, what do you think? Do you have a preference or not really?
It doesn't matter, I guess.
Awesome.
So you want to try for next Monday again?
Yeah, I'm down. That works for you. And if not, I'll put a video on the channel. I put one there last night as well. And yeah, woohoo! Show 4.5 hours of solid learning fun.
Okay, great. So have a great week, everybody, and hope to see you next week.
See you next